Are you lost? Old man, said Colonel Pierce, his voice cutting across the flight line like a bayonet drawn too soon. Laughter snapped through the air, sharp and eager, spreading across the gathered pilots like sparks jumping from dry wire. They leaned on crates and fuel drums, eyes gleaming with the cruelty of easy amusement. The taunt hung there, thin but vicious, and the men around him waited for it to land. Pierce smirked. You love that bird so much, then fly it. Old man. The laughter rose again, a rough chorus fed by arrogance and rank. Edmund Clark was 84. He stood near the edge of the hardstand, eyes fixed on the Apache, its blades still, its body crouched like a predator, at rest. The machine reflected in his gaze like an old promise not yet forgotten. I am not lost, Edmund said, his tone calm enough to disturb them more than anger would. Pierce's grin sharpened. You talk like you belong here, and the pilots laughed harder. Then Edmund said, All right, I will. And the sound of it cracked the laughter clean in half. Sergeant Harris flinched. Regulations caught in his throat, but he knew the colonel's temper too well to argue. Pierce turned his irritation into command. Get him a helmet. And the air around them stiffened. The crew obeyed, each man moving with the heavy precision of soldiers following an order they do not believe in. Edmund climbed the access ladder, slow but sure, each movement carrying the ease of repetition, learned long ago. Harris passed him the helmet, the gesture neat, formal. And Edmund fastened the strap with practiced hands, no ceremony, no hesitation, only the quiet certainty of a man returning to an old language. The pre-flight checks unfolded in a rhythm, too fluid to fake. Switches flicked, lights blinked, systems stirred. It was like watching someone wake a sleeping beast with a whisper. Within minutes, the low whine of turbines filled the silence, and the Apache came alive, obedient and waiting. Pierce's smirk thinned. The ground crew stared, their disbelief tightening into silence. Lieutenant Collins murmured, "Who taught him?" But no one answered. Sergeant Harris exchanged a brief glance with Collins, recognition ghosting his features before he looked away. Edmund settled into the seat, straps firm, movements deliberate, fingers resting on the controls with quiet precision. He did not look out at them. He simply worked, as though each motion was an echo from somewhere far behind him. The rotors turned, gathering rhythm until the air began to move with intent. The Apache lifted cleanly, hovering just above the ground, the motion smooth, balanced, effortless. Every face on the flight line froze. The noise that had filled the space minutes ago was gone. Pierce opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came, authority evaporating like steam. The machine steadied in the air, blades slicing neat circles above a field of disbelief. Sergeant Harris lowered his radio, his eyes on the old man who had just undone a room full of certainty. Respect, quiet and complete, settled across the line like dusk taking the edge from the light. Edmund kept the Apache steady, hovering like a held breath across the flight line. Sergeant Harris watched, clipboard unused, regulations folding behind his eyes. Pierce sent a curt order, and the radio chatter skittered into life. "Get him a checklist," Pierce said, and the crew moved with reluctant efficiency. Harris thumbed pages and a name tag on the bench caught his eye. Miller, a flash of something old. He looked to the man with the helmet, and the coincidence hit like an ache. Edmund ran systems with the economy of muscle memory. Switch, read, tap, confirm. Each motion exact and without waste. The crew saw the rhythm, competence that made doubt wobble. Lieutenant Collins asked, "Who authorized this?" And the question tightened the space. Pierce said, "I did," his voice small when set against what the line had seen. Harris met Collins's stare, and duty and memory competed behind their eyes. Edmund paused, fingers over a selector, and a distant memory eased into him. A radio call many years gone. A boy's quick voice lost to static. A promise that fit like a ring. He did not speak, only tightened a strap and checked an indicator. Small rituals that steadied him. The Apache answered his touch like a loyal animal, systems purring into line. Harris glanced again at his chest, and the letters Miller sat there, ordinary and terrible. He let out a breath he had not known he held, and felt an old weight shift. The ground crew clustered nearer, their bodies forming an unintended witness line. A mechanic swallowed and tapped his glove against a cable, a tiny sound like knuckles on a table. Their faces were no longer amused. They were waiting to learn a fact they were not meant to know. Collins gripped a handset. "Sir, you need to get down to the main flight line," he said, voice quick and clipped. Pierce tried to answer with orders, but the words fell short of meaning. The authority thinned. Harris looked at Collins and then at Pierce, the decision a visible strain on him. Edmund clipped in, and the aircraft settled around him like an old coat, familiar and exact. Displays brightened into a clean geometry, and his hands read the pattern without thought. He moved like trained habit, not for applause. Harris set the spare helmet down and ran a thumb over the Miller tag, as if smoothing a name into place. Recognition sat on his face like a bruise, and he did not try to hide it. He stepped back into the gap. Collins repeated the call, louder now. "Someone is airborne," and the voice reached up through the command channels. Pilots who had laughed were now pinched with curiosity, their smiles erased and replaced by attention. Pierce folded his arms, but the posture did not hold the room. The runway had shifted. Edmund eased the collective, and the Apache rose a fraction. A precise, unsung motion. It held there, poised. Neither show nor stunt. An act of quiet competence. A handset sounded in an office, and the next voice would make the private become public. Edmund eased the collective, and the Apache moved like a remembered heartbeat. The flight line watched each arc as if reading a sentence they had never known. Pilots who had jeered leaned forward, faces slack with a dawning awe. He fed the aircraft into a climbing turn, the machine answering with clean, violent grace. A wing over drew along, held breath from the tarmac. Edmund's hands, small and sure, shaped the air with an old, exacting skill. The sequence sharpened, each maneuver a punctuation in a grammar of danger. He pulled a hammerhead, and the Apache pivoted on its tail, then recovered, as if the motion had been planned by muscle alone. Mechanics pressed palms to panels, reading history through metal. A handset rang, and Collins's voice cut across channels. "Bring command down. Something is happening." Words climbed the chain and found ears that could not ignore them. Pierce barked, "Keep it local," his order thin against what the men were seeing. The Apache dove in a low pass, and then flipped into a rolling climb. Movements that belonged in combat logs. It was not spectacle. It was ledger work made physical, memory braided with craft, names from manuals passed in whispers, and the runway held its breath. A black staff car skidded onto the perimeter, and General Radcliffe stepped out with the bearing of old command. He stopped at the line and did not ask who flew. His eyes found Edmund, and a long recognition passed through him. Radcliffe said, "Ghost," a single word that cut the air like a verdict. Silence reformed around the name, and the past stepped forward in tidy, unspoken facts. Pierce's face blanched, authority peeling away like paint. Edmund guided the Apache through a final, precise run and brought it to a soft, absolute landing. No flourish, only the businesslike closing of a chapter. Radcliffe climbed the ladder with rigid, steady steps and held Edmund's eyes with a look that felt like answer and apology together. Pierce opened his mouth and closed it again. Words would not carry what had been revealed. A young pilot stepped forward and saluted, the motion small and immediate. Radcliffe said only, "He saved men we could not leave." And those words settled the line. Edmund unclipped, harness dropping away, and he did not seek applause. He nodded once to Radcliffe, a quiet report between men who had kept promises. The base absorbed the fact and rearranged itself around a new truth about merit and memory. A mechanic muttered a name, a tiny shard of memory that passed like a charged spark. Mockery softened into small acts of deference. A salute given without ceremony. Badges and braids stayed. but meaning shifted in that instant. Pierce's jaw tightened, control slipping like sand between his fingers. His chest moved with a private panic he could not display. Orders sounded thin against the weight of what had been revealed. Collins keyed the radio. Voice clipped. Command. Request immediate presence. Main flight line. Messages ran into offices, and the base stirred with purpose. Radcliffe watched, his silence holding years unsaid now. General Radcliffe stepped forward, his presence narrowing the space like a judge entering a court. He watched Edmund with a gaze that had measured worse than bravado. He said, "Ghost," and the word fell like a summons. Faces moved closer, and voices folded into a new attention. Radcliffe said, "Do you know who this is?" Pierce tried to answer, his voice small against the weight of the line. Radcliffe said, "This man is Chief Warrant Officer Edmund Clark." And the line shifted. He listed service with a cadence sharp as inventory. 7,000 hours in combat. Methods copied into doctrine. A rescue at Korangal that kept a unit alive. The facts arranged themselves, and Pierce's mockery had nowhere to stand. Harris's hand tightened, duty warring with recognition. Pierce found no bridge back to authority, his composure cracking, and his mouth forming apologies that would not land. A young pilot stepped forward. "Sir, how did we not know?" And the question hung like smoke. Radcliffe answered, "You learned from his manual at school." And the claim settled hard. Men read the sentence and understood the depth of their own ignorance, without needing explanation. Pierce's shoulders fell, and his posture burned away like old paint. Radcliffe fixed Pierce with a look that felt like an indictment. "Do you understand what you ordered here?" Pierce could not find words that matched the new geometry of the moment, and his silence was a confession. He stared at the ground, the theater of command collapsing under the weight of history. Small salutes rose without pomp, and they were offered to Edmund as if to a uniformed fact. Radcliffe placed a steady hand on Edmund's shoulder, a touch both greeting and reckoning. The line realigned itself around a truth that would not be ignored, and respect spread like a careful tide. Pierce retreated toward his staff vehicle, each step measured and awkward. There was no shouted humiliation, only a quiet that punished more thoroughly than anger. He reached the car, and for a moment his face looked like a man writing his own coda. Harris exchanged looks with Collins, the two men weighing duty, discipline, and the cost of pride. Collins said, "Sir, he will have to answer to command." And the notion hung with consequence. Orders were relayed in low voices as the base prepared to formalize what had been exposed. Edmund unhooked himself from the harness and climbed down with the slow exactness of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Radcliffe stepped close and said, "You did not owe us a show, only a truth," and his words carried both thanks and a reprimand for those who judged. The runway resettled, now arranged by a knowledge that made Pierce's next move inevitable. Pierce stood by his car, and the private rot of panic turned into a plan that tasted like retreat. He pictured letters he might sign, a resignation drafted in haste to avoid a worse reckoning, and the idea settled inside him like a slow poison. The base watched him choose retreat, and some part of authority died polite and small. Edmund climbed down from the Apache with the slow surety of a man finishing a duty. He unhooked the harness, and the movement held the weight of things unsaid. Radcliffe waited on the steps, and his face was a map of years that had not forgotten. His stance read like a ledger finally balanced. Radcliffe said, "You did what you had to," and his voice carried more than relief. Edmund nodded once, and Radcliffe's hand fell firm on his shoulder, a touch like a closed report. The hand stayed a moment, then dropped. Pierce stood by his staff car, the color gone and his posture unsteady. He tried a sentence. "Sir, I only meant," but the words collapsed under the new facts. Harris watched Pierce and felt consequence moving towards them like a tide. A young pilot approached with careful boots and steady voice. "Sir, thank you," he said. His thanks had no demand, only a recognition that made the line soften. Collins kept his distance, eyes wide with someone seeing a legend in plain clothes. Radcliffe said, You do not owe the base a performance, only honesty, folding praise into reprimand. There was no grand speech, only exacting sentences that unseated false pride. Men who had mocked earlier stood straighter, respect settling like an earned garment. Pierce retreated to his car, and a junior officer closed the door with a tidy click. Rumors moved along the line, soft and urgent, threading through crews and mess halls. Orders were drafted in low voices, and the machinery of consequence began to turn. Edmund walked back to his tools, and the path felt both ordinary and new. Men stepped aside, a salute offered as impulse rather than formality. The salute was brief and true, no ceremony needed. A mechanic touched the patch on Edmund's sleeve and mouthed the name, private and true. His eyes shone briefly. A sergeant offered to escort Edmund, but he waved the gesture away with a slight hand. He wanted no parade, only to return the machine and keep a promise that had never faded. His movements were workmanlike, precise, the language of a lifetime stitched together by action. Young airmen lingered to ask small, careful questions. In the officer's tent, Pierce started to write, his pen slow and wary. Harris read the draft, and the lines between duty and shame blurred on the page. Talk of resignation passed in low tones, a paper route to avoid a harsher spectacle. A young pilot returned. Quieter, he said. I owe you. And the words landed like a benediction. Edmund answered. Keep your eyes open, small and fierce. A lesson handed down without sermon. The pilot left with steadier steps and a head fuller with an unexpected lesson. The base rearranged itself in subtle ways. Routines shifted and greetings deepened. Change came in small nods and held doors, not proclamations. Respect spread like a ripple beyond the line, and ordinary gestures gained weight. A corporal whispered a mission story, and faces softened. Pierce watched the change, and the private choice he made next would shape the rest of his service. They called him Ghost, and now you know why. If this story left you quietly satisfied, do what Edmund would do, no fuss. Just action. Subscribe. Share it with one person who'll appreciate it. That's all. The best stories don't need theatrics, they just need to be told.